Non-duality is becoming a household word in places where interspiritual dialogue is a familiar phenomenon. So this, of course, is a big issue for all the religions, but I'll confine myself mostly to how it affects our Christian understanding of the transformative process. So non-duality is kind of a synonym for awakening or enlightenment as expressed in some of the other world spiritual traditions. I'll try to put this in a context of our scripture and tradition. And I suggest this as a way of opening us to this important and profound subject. The Christian tradition, as we experience it, or did experience it in early childhood, has little to say about non-duality. So it's a term that is a result of inter-spiritual dialogue with other world religions and sacred traditions. The first point that we need to keep in mind is that we have been in the Christian tradition, especially since the Reformation, somewhat focused on doctrinal differences rather than on the spiritual journey itself or practicing the gospel injunctions and inspirations. So there has developed in recent years what Hauser, a Jesuit who taught at Creighton University for years, describes as the Western model of spirituality, as opposed to a scriptural model of spirituality. So this development, of course, has had historical implications and has arisen, I suppose, inevitably from an overemphasis on our activity. Of course, the Christian tradition has always had a concern about works and grace and how do they relate. Well, here's a way of explaining it that inspired by Hauser's book in the Spirit, which goes like this. The Western model basically is a model of spirituality or of seeing the Christian experience as the self outside of God. Earlier parts of the tradition, and in the tradition of the great mystics, Pseudo-Dionysius, a cloud of unknowing, Ruysbrock, and especially Eckhart and the Dominicans and the Beguines, and then the Carmelites, and the whole history is about, of mysticism, is about self in God. So there's a basic conflict in Christianity itself, and it's especially prominent in our day, when for the last couple of 100 years, priests and hence bishops have never been taught anything about the contemplative dimension of the gospel or the Christian mystical tradition. The most you can find in a university or a seminary is the history of spirituality. But this is terribly important. I don't think you can have a spiritual life without grasping the implications of the scriptural model. We're supposed to become a sacrament by being always in the presence of God and in relation to God. It's not a Sunday affair, it's not a good night prayer, it's not a wake-up prayer. It's all the time that is the goal, in which we are in God and our actions are motivated by the Spirit's movement and inspiration and guidance within us. It's Christ's teaching about what to do and how you follow him if you want to follow him, and where it goes into oneness with the Trinity and with the divine life. And reading the Gospel, especially St. John's Gospel, from the perspective of the oneness that is described in other spiritual traditions that used to have nothing to do with Christianity, is very similar, but not as a path. And this is what I think is helpful to distinguish the Western model is about God outside of self. Now, already this is a relationship that is totally inadequate to the actual gospel teaching, and totally against the teaching of the mystics, who have been somewhat denigrated in the past few centuries. There's a real renewal now, but up to the beginning of the Second World War, at least, you had a very uninformed clergy that didn't believe in that one was in God or God was in you or us. And this led to the idea, especially in some Protestant circles, that God really isn't pleased with us. Not so, according to the scriptural model, which acknowledges our fault, but says very clearly that Christ has come to take these away, and that basically we are already in God, and you can't possibly exist, any creature whatsoever, without God being in you, since he's everywhere. Although theology taught this in the Middle Ages, it was the mystics who understood what this meant. So here are some of the symptoms of a Western spirituality. We initiate all the actions for proper activity, and God rewards. Well, this gives you an image of God sitting in the bleachers someplace and watching our activities, and if they're good, it's thumbs up. If they're not, it's thumbs down, and very far down in addition. So grace for the Western model is something that's building up reward in heaven, in the next life, and we keep building up merit through our efforts. In the scriptural model, grace is here now, all the time, and is present not only in the sacraments in a major way, but is trying to be present and inspire all our activities. So in the Western model, we do all our inspiration, however much influenced by our reflections on Scripture. But there's this deep psychological sense of the distrust of self, that it's just too bad that we're unworthy of God's presence. We don't know what to do if he would be living in us, because everything we do, or at least a lot of it, doesn't seem to us to have anything to do with God. So this is our animal ancestry that has a lot to do with our behavior in daily life, unless we take the spiritual life seriously and begin to interiorize and to manifest in our behavior the scriptural model for God in us. And this really is so fundamental that it can't be exaggerated. The doctrine of the divine indwelling is the way that this is usually expressed in Christian circles. But the basic same idea is in Buddha nature, which is a permanent capacity for the transformation of consciousness, or the divine spark in Vedantic Hinduism, or other names in different religions or traditions that we needn't go into. But without that conviction of God's presence within us all the time, always inspiring us, always been given as a result of Christ's redeeming activity, so to continue to see oneself as an unworthy object is just plain wrong. So you'll notice in our principles in Open Mind, Open Heart, a basic core of goodness. And some who've been trained in the Calvinistic tradition are shocked by that, because their teaching has been from childhood that you put on holiness like a cloak, but it has nothing to do with your evil, which tends to persist underneath the cloaks. So there's not a transforming process. There's a kind of mechanical change of clothes or of faculties. But the basic evil is predominant. So ascetical people are those very eager for transformation, or in the case of the spiritual model or the gospel model, or who want the rewards of this life or heaven if they're in the Western model, are in two different worlds. And one world, the Western model, goes well with rational consciousness. And as you know, rational consciousness has been developing into the technological age. We're probably at the peak of it, which is why some anthropologists think we're at an axial period in which we may move to a higher state of the possibilities of human nature, which would be the intuitive or some form of unitive consciousness that is based on actual experience of God within us. So the Western model fits nicely into rational consciousness before it is fully developed. Those who have the Western model have no idea what the mystics are talking about, or why people do centering prayer or some other method to quiet down. They don't realize the value of silence, that silence is something within us, but we also are in the silence, and the silence is this infinite, boundless presence of the ultimate reality in everything and in us. So then the non-dual functions begin to unfold, like seeing God in everyone else, in all creation, and having a capacity for moderation and for suffering with love. For these people, pain is joy. But to be a little clearer, pain is joy without ceasing to be pain. That's an important distinction, I think. Because one sees suffering or difficulties as problems, or rather not as problems. As long as you see it as a problem, you'll run away, which is the rational response. But if your consciousness is growing, you see it as a challenge and an invitation to sit with it and wait, and pretty soon the two conflicts begin to resolve, not on the rational level, because the rational level is always a level of opposites or duality, but on a non-dual level, even if it's only inchoate, you perceive that this apparent disaster, this contradiction of your heart's great love or whatever good work you're doing, as a challenge to move to a higher level of consciousness where the two are resolved in the light of that higher perspective. And they're not contradictory ultimately, but complementary. And so It's this level of consciousness that is so desperately needed in society or in the world or in politics.